Gotta be honest, I wasn't sure I was going to do a rumination on In the Beginning, or any of the movies, actually, when I first started this. This kind of wasn't something I decided until I'd finished the first episode of Season 5, actually. Seriously. I have actually, from my perspective, I've already recorded Episode 1 of Season 5. And then I was like, you know what? Maybe I should cover In the Beginning. To be honest, I don't have a lot to talk about on it. But when has that ever stopped me? Besides, there is one thing that is very worth talking about. TNT. Now, you're going to be seeing this before I talk about Season 5 tomorrow, I think, from your perspective. Let me check the calendar. Yep, tomorrow will be No Compromises. So I'm not going to talk too much about the Season 5 and all the stuff that happened there and with Ivanova and all that. That'll all be tomorrow. What I will talk about is how this was astonishing for the time. First of all, Babylon 5 was not doing well in the ratings. It was averaging around the low ones. Now, for those of you who don't actually understand Nielsen ratings or how that works, generally you track it about 1 to 4. That's the average. Anything above 4 is really, really good, and then it's just kind of a gradient down there. Anything below 1, or at 1 or below, I should say, is usually in threat of cancellation. It's a good variance to give you an idea of where that works. I could talk about Nielsen ratings themselves and how they're done, but you don't care about that. What you do care about is that Babylon 5 was consistently really underperforming. Now, I have tried to get names, but I've never found them. This is one of those weird coincidences of history where something happened, and it should happen, and it absolutely was great that it happened, but when you look back at it, it absolutely shouldn't have happened. Kind of like the original Star Wars movie, actually, to be blunt. As I talked about in the Star Wars Ruminations, when A New Hope was made, it was like a dozen different coincidences that just kind of came in. The first Lord of the Rings trilogy was another good example of this, where we just kind of got something that, honestly, probably shouldn't have been as amazing as it was. Babylon 5 had pretty much settled itself to be Season 1 through 4, and honestly probably would have been semi-forgotten. Again, I'll talk more about this tomorrow from your perspective. But what I want to mention is that TNT, someone at TNT, or someone's at TNT, had to have been either really big fans of it, or just really believed in the concept of B5 as a show. TNT spent months prep work of advertisements, and they did a separate recording of Bruce Boxleitner sitting down and being like, okay, here's B5, and here's the premise, and blah, blah, blah. And they showed, I forget the exact order of events. It was like they showed The Gathering, and then they showed Season 1 through 4, and then they showed In the Beginning, and then they started Season 5. I think that's how they did it. It was this massive marketing campaign. Now, what's interesting is that it was insanely successful, and I mean beyond all possible dreams. At the time, they were hoping at the uppermost for having somewhere in the 3 range of a rating. Like, you know, that's as high as it's getting, and that's not happening. What's more likely it was going to get is they were going to get a low 2 or a mid 2. They got a 4.1. Now, I know that's why it's hard to explain this with context. Give you a little bit of context. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is usually about 1.8, 1.9. There's a couple of other shows that I could give you examples of, but I give you that one, especially since most of my people watching this probably would understand this. Voyager was usually in the mid-2s, sometimes around the 3s at this point in time. This got a 4.1. That shouldn't have happened. Like that is a lucky coincidence. And it blew everything out of the water. And is probably one of the reasons why B5 endures as a cornerstone of science fiction and speculative history to this day. So, thanks for that, TNT. So, the episode has a framing device. Obviously, massive spoilers for stuff that happened in the last 4 seasons. But the framing device here is such that this is actually occurring during War Without End. There's a bit in War Without End where Sheridan goes to a future in which Londo is Emperor and being controlled by, the Keeper. We know those things' names now, so I feel like I can actually talk about that. And he encounters Delenn, and he learns some info, and then he's dragged back in time. This happens pretty much in the middle of that. Londo is telling a story to some of the kids as Centauri Prime burns. And we'll talk more about Centauri Prime burning later, because it hasn't actually happened yet. All I'm going to say about that is that it's an excellent framing device, and this sort of literal narration actually serves very well to emphasize the story. And I think JMS's overall writing style lends itself more towards this kind of, I hate to use the word narrative, but I don't actually know what else to call it. Because it works very well. We have a tight personal scene, tight personal scene, tight personal scene, and then when we pull the camera out, we have a narrator explaining the scope and the depth. And then we focus the camera back in when we get to real acting. And that's pretty much the approach of the whole episode, if you could call it that. It's about a 90-minute episode. Oh yeah, as much as I say, by the way, that I don't have much to talk about in the beginning, this is a really good episode. In terms of just sheer presentation, this might actually be the best episode of Babylon 5. Not in terms of the quality of the story or the acting like that, but in terms of the general presentation, the narrative structure, the acting, the directing, the editing, the music choice, the effects. This is an exceptionally well-presented story, and it's no wonder that it dragged so many people into B5. This is an attention grabber right here. And also, they spent, adjusted for inflation, I did the math myself, about $4.6 million making this episode. Think about that for a minute. So, Londo starts telling his tale to the kids. Like he said, tells the kid, "What do you want?" There's a lot of little touches in this episode that I'm not going to cover. I mean, there are dozens. There's only actually 2 I wrote down. This is one of them because it's really significant. What do you want? Londo now, of course, understands the significance of that question, not just regarding its relation to the shadows, but more because that is really the moment at which Londo catapulted into what we have now. I also love the bit where Londo pretty much personally takes ownership of the Earth-Minbari War going as horrifically terrible as it was. But I'll get to that more in just a second. He has a quote, "I was there at the dawn of the Third Age," which, if you remember, is pretty much, I think word for word, actually, the same thing he said back in the beginning of The Gathering. One of the things that JMS actually got flack for back in the day was why Londo, of all people, was doing the narration of In the Gathering, because he was such a minor character. Londo isn't even an A-list character on this show. Why is he doing the narration? Hindsight's a funny thing, but it also kind of shows how planning ahead can really help a narrative structure and story in general. One of the things I want you to note. First of all, they brought back Lefcourt, which is awesome. He's a good actor, and I liked seeing him again as the General. But I also want you to notice how there wasn't much of a galactic community at this point in history. Now, there was a galactic community. Obviously, the races had trade with each other. Obviously, they have a dog barking in the background. But in addition to that, there wasn't really like a council. There was no really major interaction from one race to the other, not like there is in by the time show starts, because that was the whole point of the Babylon 5 mission, if you remember. And the initial thing was, we need to start this whole mission. We need to start gathering the aliens together and get them coordinating and interacting with each other and all that fun stuff, right? All of that was new. This was effectively, even though a lot of these races had been in the stars for centuries at this point in time, 8 centuries I think is about the average for most of these, this was the beginning of the Third Age. This is the beginning of when the races really started coordinating and interacting with each other on a major level, having the equivalent of the EU, having regularity between each other. And I like that. It's a nice little touch. I also want you to note how, in line with this, the Minbari are basically dragons. I don't mean literally. I don't mean they're sitting on a treasure pile of hoard treasuriness. But what I mean by that is they are so unknown that most people are not even sure they can identify them on sight. Some are. Some people have some knowledge or capacity for them, but for the most part, the Minbari are just over there, and there be dragons, hence my comment about that. And of course, Londo himself actually refers to them as dragons. Now, There's nothing I can do about the barking, by the way. The Dilgar War is something I want to talk about. We don't know huge info about the Dilgar War. We do know that Earth kind of accidentally ended up in the Dilgar War, and then sort of stomped face in the Dilgar War. Now, this is an interesting thing. There's two moments that most often happen when it comes to science fiction. I myself use them in my own works within the Imperium. There's the Vulcan moment, and then there's the wake-up moment. The Vulcan moment is when you reach out to space and you find someone who just happens to be aligned with your particular mentalities or culture or perspective or politics or whatever, and suddenly you have this great ally in the stars, and it leads to this unparalleled golden age of prosperity and advancement, all that fun stuff, kind of like when the humans met the Vulcans back in Star Trek, hence the term. The wake-up moment is when you reach out to the stars and you find someone bigger and stronger than you, and you get the snot stomped out of you, and that happens a lot too. In fact, that's what happens with the Minbari, technically. Although that was a little bit of an accident as well, but the point remains. But what happened with the Dilgar is they went out to space, and they're trying this new thing, and then they encounter this alien race, and then they beat the crap out of them. Which is very strange. I'm sure you guys can come up with another example off the top of your heads, but I can't think of another work of science fiction where they've had a Dilgar moment like that, where we went out and we proved we were better than the others. Like, to give you another example, even Mass Effect, which had the First Contact War, we kind of lost that one. I mean, it was a mess, right? We didn't, as much as humans became a very important and powerful part of politics within the Mass Effect galaxy, we didn't really have a Dilgar moment over there. It's just a funny thing in its own right. And of course, now, the reason why the Dilgar moment is important from a narrative perspective is because now we are overconfident. Oh yeah, we got this. Nobody listens to Londo's warnings. And what's even funnier about that is after a certain point in time, Londo pretty much flat out even refuses to deal with them. Ironically, if that meeting had happened before then they might have understood the severity with which the other races fear the Minbari. So this leads us to Minbari Politics. Also, really quick, seeing Robin Socks again was awesome. Made me sad for a minute, but it was still great seeing him on camera. He is awesome as ever. So, Minbari Politics are very much on display in this. This is actually probably more of a Minbari story than it is anything else. We see the way they deal with the... oh god, I actually don't remember what they call them. The Rangers. We see the way that they deal with the Rangers and how they are seen as lesser, for lack of a better term. The idea that being a Ranger is actually a post of dishonor, that you can look down, sneer down at them. They're a waste of resources, a waste of time, and they're just there because we have to adhere to tradition, and in typical Minbari fashion, even though we will adhere to tradition, we will find our way to legalese our way around that a few hundred times a day, because screw those Ranger guys, right? And it's interesting to me how strongly he has to make his case to the others. I find it personal, as much as Dukat is a reasonable individual, words that I don't often get to say when it comes to speculative fiction, I have a feeling that Dukat would not have been as receptive to the idea of assisting the Rangers in their mission, if not for the fact that he was already in contact with the Vorlons. Oh, that reminds me. First of all, seeing Kosh and Ulkesh here was nice. It was good seeing them again. Well, one of them. I also really like the fact, this is a tiny little note, I told you I'd mention a few of them. Notice that it's Kosh who gives the bit of advice to Delenn. I mention that because Kosh is always the one who is a little bit more willing to interfere with the lesser races. But, more to the point, Robin Sock's character, I don't even remember his name right now, Copland or something like that, says, we keep sending ships, we've sent like 20 ships out to Vorlon territory, and they've never come back. Now, I just want to pause for a moment. I know I've already covered this in earlier stuff, in Season 1 especially, but I want you to picture for a moment the significance of that from a political perspective, from the perspective of a national body. I want you to imagine that whatever country you live in, doesn't matter, has been sending envoys in ships with crew and everything off to... I don't know. I'm trying to think of a country that most of you probably are not from. New Guinea. I probably have no New Guinea viewers right now. So I want you to picture that you have sent, or your government has sent a ship to New Guinea, and you never hear from it again. In most circumstances, that would be cause for alarm, and probably war, and would be a huge diplomatic incident, and probably lead to an alliance against them if it kept escalating from there. But no, these are the Vorlons, so we just kind of accept them. It's like, okay, take our ship. It speaks volumes for how much fear and influence the Vorlons have that no attempt has even begun to be made to really do anything about this, even though the Vorlons are effectively killing their ships. Think about that for a minute. But, moving on. So, then we see Sheridan, being the moral individual. He refuses the post, of course, refuses the position. One thing that's interesting is I wonder if Sheridan would have been able to talk Captain I'm an Idiot down from his plan. The hotshot, I actually wrote his name down as Hotshot Captain. Forgive me for diverging for a second, but one of the things that I like sometimes and hate other times about Star Trek is how they deal with first contact protocols. Now, logically speaking, first contact is a really, 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 really delicate situation. You want to do it just right, and you don't want it, and it's not like there's like one approach to it. There's not like there's one way you can do it and it will always work. You can't always be diplomatic. You can't always be talkative. You can't always have body language, So many different cultures, so many different races. You really need to be careful and touchy about that, especially if you are trying to be a generally benevolent organization. And as much as Earth keeps talking about their expansionist protocols, it is worth noting that at this point in time, they're not really some big fascist regime. They're just being expansionist. They are being economic, if you will. So they send out Hotshot Boy to go look at this situation, and I almost wonder, even though I have no evidence to it whatsoever, I almost wonder if that was pushed by the Shadows and Mr. Morden. Because you don't send the hotshot captain in a battle group in order to go scout out a race that's so terrifying that one of your biggest allies refuses to even deal with them. Or you, if you're going to deal with them. I know, that's skipping ahead a bit, but the point remains. What the hell, right? Anyways, so hotshot captain goes out there. Now, what I like most is that there's this brief moment. I know, there's a lot of little moments than this. They do a lot of subtle stuff. There's a brief moment where we see Dukat, and he's like, wait, humans? And like, you see a bit of recognition, because Dukat knows who and what the humans are, thanks to the Vorlons, since the Vorlons have been engineering humans for, I think, centuries at this point. I'm not sure the exact timeline, but, the whole telepath thing, as we've previously discussed. Or, excuse me, you will be hearing that discussion in about 3 weeks. I recorded that video earlier today. Like I said, I'm doing this a little out of order. Didn't mean to. But another nice little touch is they show Arthur. I can't remember his other name, but the guy who thought he was Arthur, the British gentleman. They show clips of him. It's just from the episode, but they show clips of him firing. Very nice touch. Very nice touch there. I've talked before about the ports open thing. I don't think I really need to rehash this territory. It's just... Really? Ports open? What's funny is they even explain why they do it. They're like, oh, we do it. We have our weapons open and everything, except that's not really how that analogy works, if you think about it. That would be the relative equivalent. I, of course, do not own a gun, but please pretend that this bit of floss here is a gun. Just here, use your imagination. Work with me. So I want you to imagine... this probably looks really silly. That as I'm approaching you like this. Okay. Hi. I mean you, peace. Come on. But Minbari are weird. I get it. Moving on. The timing of that event is also very significant, because not only did he bring the whole Great Council, which is interesting, politically speaking, because it means that they could make a Great Council ruling, aka highest level ruling, very quickly. But it also means that Delenn had basically just been inducted into the Great Council, the relative equivalent of being sworn in here on Earth. You may effectively have been elected or appointed or whatever, but you don't actually have all the legal powers of being insert position here until you put your hand and say the oath, right? Well, Delenn does have all those powers now. And then, of course, the call comes to Delenn to give the final vote. Now, what I find interesting... Delenn has always been a fairly passionate person, and we see this many, many times. The stark contrast between the woman who screams for no mercy and then the woman who's like, okay, we need to back off from this, and then the one who gets more and more disgusted and horrified as the war goes on, is an interesting contrast. More than anything, I think it emphasizes how young she is. I don't mean physically. I mean up here. It's actually a parallel to how Londo keeps telling the kids in the narration, you don't understand what orders mean. You don't understand what war means. And he keeps telling them, you don't understand what these concepts really are. I don't think Delenn understood what she was doing at all. I don't think Delenn was wise enough or experienced enough or mature enough to actually comprehend what kind of an order, what kind of a vote she was giving there. And then once it slowly began to dawn on her, and as she kind of grew up, she began to realize the full totality of what she had done. And then, well, I mean, a lot of millions of people died so she could have that lesson. So hopefully she takes it to heart and makes it up in the future. Moving on. So, yeah, Gunport's thing, that happened. The warrior caste likes to win. I'm just going to pause on that for a moment because I don't think that's 100% true, but at the same time, we see quite a few warrior caste people, and most of them do seem to like to win. Now, he, of course, was saying that as a specific jab, a very political comment, trying to specifically maneuver the conversation towards the shadows, not towards the humans. But we do see that same overall approach. I mean, what happened with the Minbari Civil War, right? The warrior caste likes to win. Food for thought. I just have a couple really brief notes here, because then the episode just kind of starts rushing through stuff. We have the Genocid'el War, go see your family before it ends kind of a situation, which is... It's never pleasant. Actually, quite a few different fictional works have done that. It's actually one of the most typical things to see in a military or in a war piece of fiction. Go see your family before you go off to die kind of a situation. But I'm not saying that's bad at all. It's a very typical thing for a good reason. I mean, most people in real life don't even get that chance, and some do, and when you do, you take it because you're probably gonna die tomorrow. This is a genocidal war. And I'm going to build up to a point here about that, but I want you to remember that this is a war of genocide. This is a total nightmare, a mess that is wreaking havoc on a galactic scale, never mind what it's doing to the humans in particular. It gets so bad that they actually consider the idea of all-out viral genocidal warfare in order to fight back against them. And Franklin, of course, refuses to do so under moral obligations. And the episode doesn't really put as much attention onto that dilemma as it probably could. I do like how it doesn't tell you what's right. Franklin says, no, I'm not going to help you commit genocide. The other guy says, this is defense against genocide. Neither one of those perspectives are actually right or correct or accurate. They're just two different perspectives in an extremely bad situation. This is an aside, by the way, but I want to give huge props to the guest stars in this episode. They really did a good job with that. So, the virus option is tossed out there. The Minbari tactics are interesting, and, of course, as ever, involve very dishonorable things or things that wouldn't be considered acceptable conduct, The old... This is something that's actually been done in real life, but I'm going to refer to fictional example because I don't want to think about that. We're going to go ahead and pretend that there's a wounded soldier over here, or actually wound a soldier, and then rig a bomb to him, so if he moves too much, then he will die. That actually happened over in Space Above and Beyond with the Chigs. And that's basically what they do. They play dead, and they have this helpless thing. It's like, all right, come on, and then they jump in and absolutely annihilate them. It is worth noting that for whatever mess, and I talked about this actually before, for whatever mess might be inferred from Sheridan's counter tactic, the only reason Sheridan's counter tactic worked is because he was a helpless, defenseless vessel sending out a distress call, and they did that because they knew that the Minbari would respond with force to destroy them. I don't think the Minbari have a lot of moral high ground here. I mentioned little touches. There's one other little touch I want to talk about. When Sheridan is thinking about his options, and by the way, the thing where he looks over and sees the captain dead, that was chilling. But as he's thinking over his options, and he finds out that it's like, okay, this is the only tactic, he actually says, very quietly under his breath, rats. Because he doesn't want to do this. It's interesting to keep that in mind. And of course, this is effectively Sheridan in his element. He has nothing. He makes do with what he has. Very improvisational thinker, very critical thinker as well. So then we have the one chance, at least the one major chance to stop this. We have G'Kar, Franklin, Sheridan, and Lennon. All of them are getting together to do this. And then, for completely unrelated reasons, the Centauri are... Londo is ordered to stop them because they think the Narn are trying to reposition the thing or whatever. It's basically an anti-Narn movement. Remember, at this point in history, and for about the next 10 years... or excuse me, no, that's not true. 12 years, forgive me, the Narn and the Centauri are going to be at each other's heels. So this is pretty much still in the midst of their Cold War. So for a completely unrelated reason, for a completely non-validated purpose, they charge in and end the last best hope that they had to get this war stopped before it went even further. Because remember, this is 2 years before the Battle of the Line. This is before the Earth-Minbari War really got bad. I mean, it was bad, but nowhere near as bad as it would eventually become. I feel JMS doesn't like it when people compare his works and try to get the allusions or the inferences or inspirations in his work. But if I can say, whether he's inspired by it or not, the situation reminds me a lot of the Great War. There's not really a lot good you can say about the Great War, but the way the Great War came to be, and the series of events that had to happen, and then the series of events that had to happen after that, and the multiple different chances we had to steer away from the Great War, it's kind of horrifying when you really sit down and read about it, and research it, and put together all the interviews, and the articles, and everything that we have historically to give us the bits and pieces of information of what led to the Great War. And I'm reminded of that because the Great War was a mess. It was a nightmare. It is arguably one of the worst wars we've ever had in history, keeping in mind that World War II, while much larger in scope and much more action-packed-y, was done in a different world than the world of World War I. The Great War happened in a world that wasn't ready for that kind of a thing, that wasn't prepared for it, that didn't understand that scope or that scale or that type of warfare. We have been changed forever by the Great War, by World War I. And that's exactly what's happening here. And they had this chance. And they were talking. You know, they even did a great job with Lennon and his English being not... They didn't go full, me, white man, kind of a thing like some writers do. But it clearly didn't have all the structure of the vocabulary and the grammar. But he had a decent amount in order to be able to convey what he wanted to convey. And that was good. Then we go to the narrative. Then Londo narrates 2 years of bloody, nightmarish, horrific war. And what I think I like most about that section is no effort is made to glorify it. No effort is made to romanticize it. Instead, it is just as absolutely horrible as it should be. There is this chilling moment where they get this woman, great actress, who portrays the president of the time, who gives a stuttering, as if she is fighting off tears, speech, basically saying, we are calling for volunteers to hold off because if you, and you are going to die. You are going to die. But if you can survive for at least 10 minutes, we could get one more transport off the planet. Think about that. Think about the fact that the humans were non-stop blaring a universal, unconditional surrender and begging for mercy. Nothing. This is a mess in every way. I am astonished that any concept or capacity for peace ever happened after the Earth-Minbari War. It is the most bloodthirsty bloodthirsty conflict in Babylon 5. It was the World War I of Babylon 5, the Great War. So, that brings us to the Battle of the Line, which is, I have no words. It's really well done, excellent CGI, some of it's recycled. We see Sinclair. This has been commented on before. I actually had a friend, Rob, at the time, who had never seen B5 before. The first thing he ever saw was in the beginning. I actually recommended he not do that, but whatever. And he didn't know who Sinclair was, and he didn't understand the significance of Sinclair until later, because in the beginning doesn't actually emphasize Sinclair that much. I mean, that's Valen himself, and it's like, oh my gosh, but that's about it. He has, it's like he's basically just another random NPC, you know what I mean? But so yeah, the Battle of the Line happens. They find their excuse to call off the fighting. What I find interesting about that is, despite everything, even Robin Sock's character agrees the fighting needs to end. But what I find interesting about that, and this has actually been commented on before, is the war had to drive itself out. The burning, fiery, holy war needed to stop before it got to the point where it was like, okay, hang on. Before even the warrior caste was tired of winning. This is an excellent episode, and if you have the availability, I very strongly recommend you go ahead and see it. Tomorrow, by your perspective, we will go ahead and start Season 5 proper, and I do very much hope to see you there. See you around, guys.